Solidity. So you can see an example here. Solidity lets you create your own functions with arbitrary names. We can see these are examples here like setName and getName. And you can see that these functions take arguments like this string memory name. Okay, this just sets the state variable here of example 1. So if I were to call this function, I could update the value of this state variable name. So in this case, this name right here is a local variable that's only accessible inside this function. And this is a state variable, which is accessible outside the smart contract if we call it public. Okay, or you can do getName here. And it's also available everywhere else inside the smart contract. So in Solidity, there are two main types of functions, write functions and then also read functions. So whenever you're writing new information to the blockchain, you have to pay a gas fee. So you'll pay some cryptocurrency fee whenever you call this function. Whenever you read information from the blockchain, it's completely free and doesn't cost any gas. So just like variables, functions also have visibility. So you can see example, this function is public, so it's accessible outside the smart contract. And if I were to reset this function to internal, it would be only accessible inside the smart contract. And here's an example of all the different visibilities you can apply to a variable. So a variable is no visibility, a variable is private visibility, which means it's only accessible inside the smart contract, an internal variable, which is also accessible inside the smart contract, but can be inherited, and then public, which can be called inside, outside, and also inherited. And for functions, you can see that like this. Here's a public function. It can be called outside the smart contract. It can also be called by another function. A private function, which cannot be called outside the smart contract, but can be called inside of another function inside the same contract. An external function, which can only be called outside the smart contract, and an internal function, which can only be called inside the same smart contract like this from another function. So functions also have built-in modifiers in Solidity, like view, for example. This means that the contract does not modify the state of the blockchain, but it can read the state, like read this state variable value name, for example. Pure functions, which do not modify the state and also cannot read the state, so they cannot read name, for example. And then also payable functions, which are allowed to receive Ether cryptocurrency whenever the transaction is submitted. And Solidity also lets you create your own custom modifiers, which can be applied to functions. So here's an example. You can do modifier only owner. This restricts who can call a specific function. This requires the message sender. The person who's calling the function is the owner of the contract. So you create it like this, and then you apply it to your function like this. So there's one more function you should know about in Solidity. It's a special function called the constructor function, which you can see with this keyword here. So this is a function that's run once and only once whenever the contract is initialized or put on the blockchain. So it accepts arguments just like other functions. You can make it payable. You can send Ether in. It works pretty much like everything else, except you can only call it once. Likewise, there's a few more variables you should know about in Solidity. These are global variables, which are available inside of any smart contract. So some examples are this, which corresponds to the address of the current smart contract that you're coding against. Message, which has a few more values attached to it, like sender, which is the person calling the function. TX, which is the transaction. You can get the origin of that transaction. Message.value, which is the amount of cryptocurrency, same with that transaction. We also have block, which is the current block on the chain. You can get the number, you can get the timestamp, the chain ID, and many other values.